When two officers placed her under arrest that day, they had no clue that fate would bring them face to face with her again, only this time in a courtroom where she would stand as the judge deciding their destiny. It was a bright, picturesque afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park buzzed with life. Children's laughter filled the air, joggers kept their steady pace along the winding trails, and families enjoyed peaceful picnics beneath the shade of towering oak trees. Amidst the lively yet serene environment, a woman sat alone on a wooden bench near the pond. A thick, hardcover book lay open in her hands, her fingers resting lightly on the pages as she read with quiet focus. Her name was Camille, an accomplished and highly respected attorney who rarely had the luxury of leisure. On this particular day, she had carved out a small pocket of time from her relentless schedule to simply breathe, to lose herself in the world of literature. But her moment of solitude was abruptly shattered. A sharp, jarring screech of tires against pavement snapped her out of her trance. A police cruiser came to a sudden halt by the curb, its presence immediately drawing the attention of nearby parkgoers. Two officers emerged, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable but heavy with authority. As their eyes swept the area, they locked onto her. Camille, the only person sitting alone in the vicinity. "Ma'am, may we have a word with you?" One of the officers called out, his voice laced with something that felt more like suspicion than simple concern. Camille lifted her gaze from her book, her expression calm, unreadable. Without hesitation, she nodded. Of course. She closed her book with care, placing it gently on her lap. The second officer stepped forward, his tone clipped and direct. "We got a report about some suspicious activity in the area," he stated, his eyes scanning her like she was an unsolved case. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Camille's brow furrowed, genuine confusion flickering across her face. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." She lifted the book slightly, as if offering proof of her innocence. But the officers didn't relax. Their scrutiny remained sharp, unrelenting. "We're gonna need to see some ID," the first officer demanded. Camille felt a shift in the air. A slow but unmistakable tension was creeping in. Her pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure. "I don't understand," she said evenly. "What's the reason for this?" "Routine check," the second officer replied curtly. But his tone said otherwise. A few people had begun to gather at a distance, whispering among themselves, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Camille exhaled, reaching into her bag to retrieve her wallet. With measured movements, she handed over her driver's license. One of the officers took it, studying the card with an intensity that seemed entirely unnecessary. "Camille Johnson," he read aloud, almost mockingly. His eyes flicked back to her. "What exactly is your business here, Ms. Johnson?" Camille inhaled slowly, centering herself before responding. "I live here. I came to the park to read and enjoy the weather. Is that a problem?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see," he muttered, handing back her ID. But instead of walking away, the questioning continued. It was no longer a routine check if it ever had been. "Do you always carry a book that big around?" one of them sneered. "Are you alone? Or are you waiting for someone?" The other officer asked, his hand resting subtly but unmistakably on his belt. Camille had been in many high-stakes situations before. She was no stranger to pressure, having faced countless legal battles in courtrooms. But this wasn't a case to argue or a debate to win. This was different. The power dynamic was blatant, the undertones of their words all too familiar. Yet, she remained steady. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me exactly what I'm being accused of," she stated, her voice firm but controlled. The first officer stepped closer. His expression darkened. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. Camille held his gaze, unwavering. "I know the law, and I know that sitting in a public park is not a crime." But reason was not part of their agenda. Without warning, the officer grabbed her arm. "Stop resisting," he barked. Camille's body stiffened in shock. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone, hitting record. Others exchanged glances, some hesitant, others outraged. "Stop resisting," the officer repeated, louder this time, as though trying to put on a show for the growing audience. Camille's heart pounded as she felt the cold, unyielding metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. A storm of emotions swirled within her: anger, humiliation, disbelief, but she forced herself to stay composed. As the officers led her toward the police car, ignoring the rising questions and protests from bystanders, Camille turned her head slightly. Amid the sea of faces, she locked eyes with a young woman holding her phone up, recording every moment. For a brief second, there was an unspoken exchange between them, a silent understanding, a plea, an acknowledgement, a vow to remember what was happening. And then, with a forceful slam, the car door shut behind her. As the car door slammed shut, Camille inhaled sharply. This wasn't the end of the story, far from it. If anything, this was just the beginning. The cramped back seat of the police cruiser felt colder than it should have. The air was thick with silence, save for the occasional crackle of the police radio breaking the stillness. Camille's mind raced. For years, she had fought for justice, defended the rights of those wrongfully accused, and stood in courtrooms where the law was meant to be upheld. But now, she found herself on the other side of the system she had dedicated her life to understanding and challenging. The absurdity of it all struck her, but there was nothing amusing about this. Just a seething, quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. Outside the window, her reflection ghosted over the blurred city lights as they sped through the streets. The cool glass pressed against her skin, grounding her in the harsh reality of what was happening. The handcuffs bit into her wrists, a sharp, relentless reminder of how quickly power could be abused. She shifted slightly, wincing at the pain, but she refused to let it show. By the time they reached the station, the weight of the situation settled heavier on her chest. And then it got worse. The booking process was cold, mechanical, deliberate. It was designed to strip away dignity piece by piece. Her fingerprints were taken, her photo snapped under the unforgiving glare of a fluorescent light. Every step, every motion, felt like an attempt to reduce her to something smaller than she was. "Enjoy your stay," one officer muttered with a smug smirk as he shut the cell door behind her. Camille sat on the cold bench, her fingers interlaced tightly in her lap, her jaw clenched. She replayed the events from the park, over and over. How had a quiet, peaceful moment turned into this? But deep down, she already knew the answer. Prejudice. Minutes stretched into hours. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, but she refused to let them break her. She wouldn't let them have that satisfaction. Finally, footsteps echoed in the corridor. A young officer appeared at her cell, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. "Miss Johnson, you're being charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he stated, monotone, detached. Camille's head snapped up, her voice sharper than she intended. "On what grounds?" The officer barely blinked. "You can discuss that in court." And just like that, he turned on his heel, walking away as if she were nothing more than paperwork to file. She exhaled slowly, her lawyer instincts kicking in. The charges were flimsy, and she knew it. But that didn't mean the fight ahead would be easy. Cases like this, cases like hers, never were. Eventually, Camille was released on bail. The moment she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. She barely had time to process before she spotted a familiar face waiting by the curb. Camille. Marissa, her close friend and colleague, rushed toward her. Relief and concern were written all over her face. "Are you okay?" Camille nodded, but her body betrayed her, a slight tremor in her hands. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. As they drove away, the car was silent, save for the hum of the engine. Marissa kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Camille did. "I'm not letting this slide, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa's hands tightened on the wheel. "What are you thinking?" Camille's gaze stayed fixed on the passing streetlights. "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening." Her voice was calm, but beneath it was a storm. I have the knowledge. I have the tools. And now I'm going to use them. That night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, her hands moving steadily across a legal pad as she outlined her next move. Case files were scattered around her, law books left open to pages she had long since memorized. The work wasn't rushed, it was deliberate. Every word, every note was a weapon. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been humiliated, dismissed, or silenced. Days turned into weeks, and the fight took on a life of its own. The video of her arrest, captured by that young woman in the park, spread like wildfire. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own experiences, their own frustrations. The message was clear. Camille's story was not just hers. And with every message, every phone call, every comment, her resolve hardened. But what she didn't know was that justice was about to take an unexpected turn. The battle had only just begun.